Subcommittee will come to order. The first hearing for the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Subcommittee of the 118th Congress. It's my honor to serve as chairman of this important subcommittee once again. I first came on this subcommittee in 1983 and soon thereafter became the ranking member and then chairman and back to ranking member, so I've been all over the board. But I love this subcommittee and I like the jurisdiction that it covers with the government. We've got a few new members of the subcommittee, including myself, including Representative Tony Gonzalez, Representative Andrew Clyde, and Representative Jake Elsie on this side of the aisle, and Joe Morelli across the aisle. So we welcome all of you new members and returning members, including Representatives Adderholt and Judge Carter. He's returning to the subcommittee after an absence of several years, and Representative Klein and Garcia, as well as Ming, Rappersberger, and Trone. We're fortunate to have Representative Matt Cartwright serving as the ranking member. As you know, he chaired this subcommittee for 4 years, and we'll benefit from his input and experience as we move forward this year. We'll follow the 5-minute rule for questions. Of course, I don't plan on cutting anyone off mid-sentence, but we'll do so shortly thereafter. We'll recognize members in order of seniority based on who's present at the beginning of the hearing, going back and forth between our two sides. For latecomers, I'll recognize you in order that you arrive, continuing to go back and forth between the sides. Well, I'm sure that we will not always agree on the issues coming before the subcommittee. All members and witnesses will be heard and respected. This morning's hearing is with the Inspector General from the Department of Justice, the Honorable Michael Horowitz. With the federal debt surpassing $31 trillion, it is imperative that this committee ensure that every dollar provided to the agencies is spent efficiently and appropriately. The President has proposed to increase spending in virtually every area of government and pays for it with proposed tax increases. However, the House budget resolution is not likely to adopt that approach. As the Appropriations Committee works to appropriately fund the government, we must continue to look for additional savings wherever possible. Our allocation this year is likely to limit the funding available to agencies within our jurisdiction. While we will do our best to meet the needs of the agencies and priorities of members, it's possible we will not be able to meet everyone's request. Therefore, we've asked the Inspector General to come up and discuss the challenges that the Department of Justice is facing and how we can help improve the department's performance and reduce spending. Given your expertise, we would like to hear your ideas on how the department can improve its work, accomplishing its core mission, while at the same time reducing spending and debt burdens placed on future generations. With that, I want to welcome our witness today, the Honorable Michael Horowitz. He's been Inspector General since 2012. Sir, we value your efforts to promote integrity and efficiency at the Department of Justice. And this subcommittee, having worked with you for many years now, can attest that you lead by example. Having led your office for over a decade now, you've proven yourself to be effective, impartial, and dedicated to your work. We appreciate your willingness to answer the hard questions, time after time. We also appreciate your command of the myriad programs and the activities of the Department of Justice, from the matters that dominate the national headlines down to your detailed oversight of your own annual budget. We look forward to the opportunity to discuss with you today several major challenges facing the Department of Justice. So once again, we appreciate your being here and your hard work on behalf of the American people. Before we proceed, let me recognize our ranking member, the former chairman of the committee, subcommittee, Matt Cartwright, for any remarks that he may wish to make.
Well, thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. Particularly thank you for the kind comments. And speaking of valuable input and experience, I would venture to say that you have forgotten more about CJS than I will ever know. But it's nice to have you back on CJS, and it's nice to have veteran CJS members, Representatives Meng, Ruppersberger, Trone, Garcia, Klein. Thank you for rejoining us and welcoming the new members, Messrs. Gonzalez, Clyde, and Elsie. Nice to have you with us. Looking forward to your contributions, as well as Congressman Joe Morelli from Rochester, New York. Looking forward to a good Congress within this subcommittee and a lot of collaborative efforts to make a good bill. And I'd like to join the chairman in welcoming you, Mr. Horowitz, our Inspector General for the Department of Justice, to the subcommittee. Inspector General occupies a unique position with the responsibility to oversee operation and performance of the DOJ and promote the department's integrity, efficiency, and accountability. I am incredibly proud of the strong funding increase we provided in last year's enacted bill for your critical work. And during today's hearing, I look forward to hearing how those investments will be applied to continue the importance of the important oversight work of the IG across the Department of Justice. I do like Chairman Rogers' idea of starting with you as our first hearing, because that'll give us clues about how we might question other witnesses that come before this subcommittee. I also expect today we'll cover a wide range of topics. We want to hear about how DOJ is dealing with other significant challenges in the department, such as efforts to improve the management of our federal prison system, combat the efforts of transnational criminal organizations to traffic illicit opioids in the United States, to counter foreign influence and cyber threats, fight violent crime, of course, and protect voting rights and institutional integrity. So once again, we welcome Inspector General Horowitz, and we look forward to your testimony. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will endeavor to be respectful of our witnesses' time, and we'll follow up with you should we have any additional questions. So, Mr. Horowitz, you're recognized for an opening statement, and without objection, your written statement will be entered into the record. I would ask that you try to keep your statement to 5 minutes so we can have additional time for questions.
I will certainly do that.
The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you, Ranking Member Cartwright. Greetings to the other members of the subcommittee. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our discussion today. But as you all know, if there's anything that you'd like to talk to me about afterwards, I'm always available to come up, meet with you, meet with your staffs to discuss further issues. And I also want to begin by thanking the subcommittee for your tremendous support for my office during my tenure as IG. Particularly, I want to call out and thank you for the budget last year. You have given us your support over the years. Unfortunately, because of funding limitations and pay raise issues that have eaten up much of the increases we have received, we frankly hadn't been able to keep pace with the growth in the department of other parts of the department, including the two largest parts of the department, which are the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And the funding last year allowed us to do that. Look forward to talking about that, including the creation of our first ever interdisciplinary unit in the office. You gave us $4 million last year to do that. We're going to have 16 people, agents, auditors, inspectors, a victim witness coordinator for the first time ever, working together to look at BOP issues. There are many, and I know we'll be talking about them today. There's been no slowdown in our work during the pandemic. It's been a challenge at times. We haven't been able to visit auditees, grant recipients and contractors as much as we would like. But just to give you a sense of the work we've done, in FY '22, we issued 89 reports, 463 recommendations, identified $7.8 million in question costs. We undertook 190 new misconduct investigations, resulting in 80 arrests, 129 administrative actions, and $23 million in recoveries. And that's for FY '22. We continue to do an enormous amount of oversight work at the BOP, at the FBI, at ATF, at the Marshal Service, and at DEA. We also issue annually, as you know, our Top Management and Challenges report. Last year's report referenced 9 challenges for the department. They include enhancing cybersecurity and countering cybercrime, strengthening public trust in the department, safeguarding and promoting national security, enhancing the department's response to the opioid crisis, managing the post-pandemic impact on the department's operations, strengthening police-community partnership and the response to violent crime, effective management of Department of Justice contracts and grants, managing human capital in the department, and lastly, of course, the perennial DOJ challenge that we found, which is maintaining and improving the operations of the federal prison system, which continue to take an outsized amount of our resources to oversee. We are asking for some additional enhancements this year that are focused in terms of personnel on 8 additional agents to station across the country to deal with the rising amount of reports coming to us as this committee enhances the department's operations at the FBI, at the BOP, and other places. You wouldn't be surprised to learn, of course, that that results in additional cases coming our way and additional demands on our resources. So we're looking for 8 additional agents to do that work. We have about 135 or so agents across the country to oversee over 130,000 department employees. So we are spread pretty thin, but it's a group, as I mentioned, that has continued to work effectively during the pandemic. We've also asked for enhancements to improve our ability to handle cybersecurity responses, as well as improving our safety and security of our own systems and enhancing our ability to conduct cyber-related investigations and support our body-worn camera program. Lastly, I'll just mention, I referenced in my statement, 2 legislative areas that we are looking forward to addressing and working with the Congress. One, the House has supported for many years, which is to give us authority over federal prosecutors. They should be subject to the same oversight as every other employee at the Justice Department. That isn't the case currently. The House has supported it virtually unanimously. The challenge has been getting it through the Senate. We're looking forward to working again with Congress to getting that done. And then additionally, an issue that has come before you, the Congress before, which is our ability to subpoena witnesses for testimony. A number of individuals at the department retire while under investigation. In sexual assault cases, in whistleblower retaliation cases, in fraud cases, contractors, that happens as well at. We want to have the ability to question those individuals even after they leave the department or their contracting entity so that the taxpayers can understand and victims can understand what happened when wrongdoing occurred. So that's an area I'm looking forward to working with the Congress with as well. So with that, again, it's I'm very appreciative of being here today and look forward to talking with the committee about the
Well,
various
thank you very
issues.
much, Mr. General. I wanted us to start our season of hearings with the inspectors general of the agencies that we have jurisdiction on, because the IG's supposed to have the best knowledge of what's going on in the department and would be able to help us understand problems that you may face. So thank you for coming here today and opening up our season of hearings. The work of the IG has proven invaluable at identifying misconduct as well as potential savings within department operations. We've seen the tremendous impact of your office's work in the department grant space alone. In your testimony and your budget submissions, you noted that OIG's jurisdiction has been particularly a challenge for the agency, even going so far as to call it an impediment to strong and effective independent oversight over agency operations. That's pretty strong language. As this committee works through your budget request and the depth of your work, help us understand the limitations to your jurisdiction that you're referencing, especially what individuals or type of work are you prevented from investigating? Tell us.
Yes, so the most significant area is oversight over federal prosecutors in their work as prosecutors at the department. The IG Act carves out from our jurisdiction professional misconduct allegations against lawyers. So we have two systems of oversight at the department. Statutorily independent Inspector General oversight over all non-lawyers, including FBI agents and others. And then you have the lawyers at the department and professional misconduct allegations against them. Those go to the Office of Professional Responsibility at the department. We have challenged that since we were created 35 plus years ago. There is no principled reason to send those to an office that is overseen by the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General, whose leader is appointed by them, who can be removed by them, who I would venture to say I don't think any member of Congress has ever seen before you to testify publicly. I think there's a lack of transparency, and I know from speaking with prosecutors across the country, defense lawyers across the country, various non-governmental organizations, that their confidence in that oversight ability has been challenged over the years.
Has this been tested in court?
It has. So there have been several judges who have raised significant concerns about how OPR has handled oversight, including perhaps among the most famous was the Ted Stevens case after his acquittal. And the judge who oversaw that issued a stinging opinion about the oversight work that occurred. There are multiple other judges who have raised concerns about OPR's work. Of course, we're not part of those efforts because we're not statutorily authorized to investigate or handle those matters.
So the lawyers in the department cannot be checked on by you or anyone else. Is that correct?
For professional misconduct, that's correct. If they commit a crime, if they engage in wrongdoing outside the department, we have the ability to look at them. But if they fail to follow their ethical and professional responsibilities, fail to comply with department policies in the courtroom, for example, failing to produce discovery to defendants, whether you're talking drug cases or corporate crime cases, that's the case. It would go to Office of Professional Responsibility, not to the OIG. If they were an FBI agent, it would come to us.
Is this made in other federal agencies?
No other agency has this issue. The Security and Exchange Commission, which has lots of lawyers, the IG has oversight over them. Federal Trade Commission, the same. I could go down the list of agency after agency. We're the only ones where that carve-out exists.
What does this say about independence, effective oversight, and the like?
Yeah. So I think it raises multiple issues. First, transparency. The public should know where there have been wayward prosecutors, where there have been wayward lawyers in the department. That transparency is not as robust as it would be with our work. Second, accountability. To my mind, transparency goes with accountability. Where you have transparency, I say this often, I'm a graduate of Brandeis University. I cite to Justice Brandeis's famous quote about transparency being the best disinfectant. If the public knows, if lawyers at the department know that their misconduct is going to be public, I think that helps reform behavior. It deters other folks. And so it has real impact, I think, the absence of that kind of accountability.
Is this policy statutorily?
It is. So it's in the IG Act, and so Congress would need to change that law.
I see. Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Horowitz, I want to talk about your office. I mean, your office is charged with rooting out the unholy trinity of waste, fraud, and abuse in the Department of Justice, and it's such an important thing to us to conduct this kind of oversight, and that's why we begin with you as our first witness. And there are two big limitations on your ability to do that, root out waste, fraud, and abuse. The first is the statutory authorization limitations that you've already discussed and that Chairman Rogers has brought out. The other one is funding. Now, you may be aware that the Republican House Freedom Caucus has proposed capping fiscal year 2024 spending levels at the fiscal year 2022 levels, which would require cuts to your funding as much as 22% below last year's funding level. So I'd like to ask you, speak to us frankly, illustrate for us how the important work of your office would be impacted by a 22% cut.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. For us, it would be an overwhelmingly significant cut. We would be reduced from our current number, which is $149 million budget, to a $128 million budget. That would be a $21 million cut for us, and doesn't take into account the potential for the 5.2% pay raise, or whatever the pay raise is. But if it's 5.2%, for us, that's about $4.1 million, $4.2 million. So you're talking 21 million cut on top of at least $5 million increased costs, potentially, depending upon rent, healthcare, pay raises. That translates for us to about 89 positions out of our 500 plus positions. And the reason for that is we're relatively small by comparison to the department. We have 80% of our costs go to personnel, 9% go to rent, 7% go to various agreements we have, like paying the department back for cybersecurity, other things that we have to pay for. That leaves us 4% that goes for travel, training, all the other stuff. So we don't have the ability, like other parts of the department that maybe are funded at the hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, if you're the FBI and the BOP, to absorb that kind of cut. It goes straight to the bottom line for us.
Well, Mr. Horowitz, I was listening as you were responding to Chairman Rogers' questions about capacity of your office and how I came away with the impression that you're stretched thin right now.
Yeah. The reason we got the increases last year, having testified here in the House and the Senate about, for example, just the BOP issues, is how frustrated, rightly, everybody was with the lack of effective oversight. We have, I mentioned before, about 135 agents to cover the entire country. That's the FBI, ATF, DEA, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Half of our resources go to the BOP, even though they're only, I say, about 25% of the department's budget. That means we have about 65, 70 agents to cover 121 federal prisons, 160,000 inmates, 40,000 or so employees at the BOP.
Why the outsized need for oversight of BOP as opposed to other areas?
Well, I could spend days talking about some of the challenges at the BOP, but to give you an example, we're dealing with sexual assault cases that are, the good news is, coming forward and being reported to us,
Right.
but it creates a substantial, just yesterday, the former warden at the Dublin prison in California was sentenced to 7 years in prison because of the extended sexual assault that he engaged in there. The chaplain had been previously sentenced from that prison. We have another person under indictment and others under investigation there. MCC New York has been closed by the BOP because it was in such problematic state. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary is largely closed because of that.
So where you find out abuse is going on, you have to get involved in that.
We have no choice, and members are rightly coming to us in both the House and the Senate saying, what can you do to do more of? And so just one of the things we did this year, thanks to your funding from last year, we just did our first inspection. We went out to Waseca, Minnesota prison, an all-female prison, which we chose as the first prison to go to because it was lower on our risk profile so that we could do one, first ever surprise inspection.
That's good. Let me finish
Yeah,
with my last
sure.
question. What immediate actions would you and/or your office be forced to take as a result of a 22% funding cut?
We would have to immediately, through attrition, start losing people. There's just no choice. We could look at giving up space, which, by the way, if you looked at my budgets last year's, I have not asked for any more space, even when you've given us the resources, because we're reconfiguring our offices to put more people in the same space. So, but I'd now have to start figuring out how to give up rent. But that's a longer-term solution. So the only immediate way would be to, first of all, cut out travel and training. So we couldn't get on-site as much as we'd like to with grant recipients, contractors, which was the problem during the pandemic. We're now finally back on planes and going back places for the last year plus. And you can't do an audit if you're not on the ground. You can't do an inspection of a prison if you're not on the ground. That's my personal view.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. Inspector General, thank you for yours as well. Thanks for running a relatively lean operation compared to other federal organizations. And thank you for being the disinfectant. I like that metaphor. I think that's very true. And relative to that, actually, a very pertinent conversation, the FISA renewal discussions that we're having this year. I would submit DOJ has got a brand name issue, specifically the FBI, specifically the FISA, and then specifically within FISA, the Title I. Can you, I've looked through the brief here, and I don't see how you interface with accountability and oversight within the FISA processes, and that's going to be a very sensitive and important topic. Can you talk to that a little bit and what we can do to help shed that transparency, not only on the process, but also the fixes and the protocol changes that have happened as a result of the self-admitted abuses, but then the accountability side of that as well, if you can.
Excellent. Yeah, very important question. Obviously, very significant issue from our FISA report back in 2019, the very significant challenges that we've seen there. We've done a fair amount of oversight work on the use of 702, the use of other FISA amendment authorities, the use of FISA in that context. With our limited resources, we always are trying to do that kind of work. I'll say one of the challenges on that is the public doesn't know about it as much, and you don't know about it as much because of classification challenges that we faced over the years. And again, that's a subject I'd be happy to talk about here and with you further. It's a substantial issue. The FBI comes forward and says trust us, this is helping a lot. And then we go and trying to understand what that is, and it's extraordinarily highly classified information, some of which I think is very relevant and might be very helpful to the discussion.
Yeah.
Others maybe not as much.
Yeah.
One of the things that came out of the FISA report that we talked about with the Hill briefly, and you all obviously have to make this decision from a policy standpoint, but much like what happened last year with BOP, where this committee gave us the $4 million to set up the interdisciplinary group. Excuse me, let me just. My allergies are not great right now.
That's all right.
We talked about this back in 2019 with some members of Congress, which was the possibility of funding, dedicated funding to doing that oversight over the BOP.
Okay.
I mean, over the FBI.
Well, I'll give you a break and let you clear your throat, but I would say I sit on Intel, and so I actually am able to get some of those briefs, and I myself still cannot gain full confidence in the process, the fixes, the accountability. And so I think we do, whether it's classified, ideally, like you said, transparency is the best disinfectant, especially on something that does go to the public's trust in this case is very important. But I think we as a team need to figure out how to best get a product out that does show the oversight and the accountability. And you don't need to comment on that, Inspector General, unless you want to, but I appreciate you being here today, and thank you for your time. I yield back.
No, absolutely, and look forward to talking with you further about this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cartwright, and thank you, Mr. Inspector, for being here today. You talked a little bit about BOP, and I wanted to ask specifically about a report that your office issued recently evaluating the BOP's efforts to address sexual harassment and assault committed by inmates towards staff, and was also curious if perhaps there would be a future one to your comments about inmate assault as well. One of the main areas of evaluation was BOP staff training on inmate and staff sexual harassment. The report found several concerning issues, including the lack of training content on staff sexual harassment and the BOP's inadequate data on such harassment. They responded to your recommendation around these trainings, saying that they believe their training already incorporate this work and further action was unnecessary. Do you agree with the BOP's assessment that their training fully meets the expectations of your recommendation?
We don't, and one of the things we will continue to do is conduct oversight over the BOP on this point, make sure they respond adequately to our recommendation. We don't close a recommendation till we decide to close it. They don't get to decide that. And if they disagree and there's a continued disagreement, that ends up before the Deputy Attorney General. And one of the things that has happened in the past when there has been disagreement, we've had testimony about this in front of Congress, and your oversight on this has been particularly helpful, this committee and other committees in that regard.
Do you know if there are specific ways or ideas that on how they should expand their current training?
So I think one of the things we've seen at the BOP, frankly, is a failure of strategic planning in so many different areas. I think one of the things that they need to do in training is not only give enhanced and focused training, but have a better sense of what their overall strategy is for that training. So obviously this is for management to decide how best to do it. We will give our views on it, but I think there are several areas where they can improve their work in that space.
Thank you so much. And another issue within the BOP is the issue that I've been working on for a long time about period poverty. And we all know that in the bipartisan First Step Act of 2018, it required the provision of menstrual products to meet industry standards to give to inmates for free and in quantities that meet the health needs of each prison. These items, as you all know, are not luxury items, they are necessary items. And incarcerated women should not bear the burden of our agency being out of compliance with an existing law such as this. Can you speak to the BOP's compliance with the First Step Act requirements for provision of these products? And are women in these facilities able to access them without cost?
So, Congresswoman, back in 2015 or 2016, we actually issued a report on how the BOP was dealing with feminine hygiene products and female inmates generally. That was a recommendation we made, and right after we issued the report and there was a hearing about it, the BOP started changing their policies. And so I was very glad to see that happen. They have made tremendous progress since then, over the last 6 years. As to the First Step Act, there are still several areas where I have concerns about beyond just that area, and happy to talk about those as well. But in that space, we have seen significant improvement to the credit of BOP. There's more to be done, let me just say, but it goes to the importance of these hearings and frankly, the bill that you will all write. When you all put in the bill particular focus or efforts and recommendation or mandates, things happen. And so I would encourage the committee, as you look at these issues, to think about how the appropriations law can be used and the bill can be used to support the reforms that should happen.
Thank you so much. And just to close, if the DOJ and BOP's budget was reduced, how difficult would it be for the BOP to meet this statutory required mandate?
So we haven't done any specific work in that space as to how it would impact them. They have many areas where they need to address change. Cameras, we've talked about for years. Congress passed the camera bill last year, and I know this committee has been very involved in that effort. Staffing. I'm sure we'll be talking about this further. The BOP really doesn't have a good strategic approach to staffing. The number of inmates have dropped from 220,000 to 160,000 over the last 8 or 9 years, but yet some prisons are still substantially understaffed. And so the BOP needs to do a better job understanding its staffing situation. In terms of infrastructure, we're going to be issuing a report in a few weeks about that. The BOP is, again, strategically has not evaluated how to fix its prisons. Our Wasika report, we went out to Wasika prison expecting it to be a low-risk prison. We're going to be issuing a report soon about that, regarding staffing concerns, healthcare concerns, infrastructure concerns. So these issues are substantial. As I sit here, I can't speak to could they reapportion certain monies in certain areas to other areas that would meet the needs, but they have a need for reform in a number of areas that will require funding. Whether they have that now, could more efficiently do that, I can't fully speak to that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, and for holding this very important hearing, and the Honorable Mr. Horowitz, thank you for being here. Like many other Americans, I have grave concerns regarding the way the Justice Department has conducted itself in recent years. It's become apparent that there is a two-tiered justice system that is rotting our republic, and it is past time to dismantle this injustice, I think, before it further erodes the bedrock foundation of our nation. Just earlier this week, the House Judiciary Committee and the Select Subcommittee on Weaponization of the Federal Government released a startling report that shows the Biden administration and the DOJ shamelessly targeted concerned parents at school board meetings. This report outlines how the National School Board Association collaborated with the White House to develop the language for the National School Board Association's September the 29th, 2021 letter to President Biden, urging the use of federal law enforcement and counterterrorism resources, including the Patriot Act, against concerned parents across the nation.
Then on October the 4th, 2021, just 5 days after the National School Board Association letter to President Biden, Attorney General Garland issued a memo that inserted federal law enforcement into local school board meetings. In Attorney General Garland's testimony to Judiciary Committee last year, he stated that his sole basis and source for this memo was ironically the very letter from the National School Board Association to President Biden, which the two had collaborated on. The FBI operationalized Attorney General Garland's memo to create a new special tag to label and track, quote, school board threats. The FBI then weaponized this, opening dozens of investigations into concerned parents' conduct at school board meetings. We saw the impact of this memo across the nation, including in my district of North Georgia, where the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia deployed domestic terrorism resources against parents. A parent concerned about radical woke policies at their child's school should not be accosted by the federal domestic terrorism squad. So my question to you is, do you know the amount of resources that the Department of Justice spent on the creation and implementation of the Department of Justice memo?
I don't have those numbers as I sit here today. I can certainly follow up and talk with you further, Congressman.
That would be great. I would appreciate knowing how much the department spent on that. Do you think it was appropriate for the DOJ to spend its limited resources on investigating parents at school board meetings?
You know, Congressman, I stay out of the policy decisions. That's not our, we quite clearly by law are not supposed to get in policy disputes. That's really a question for the committee to decide in terms
Okay.
of funding. So
All right.
I'll defer on that.
Okay, all right. Well, then I just look forward to your response on the amount of money that they actually spent on this. Now, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to submit the report titled A Manufactured Issue. A manufactured issue and misapplied priorities. Subpoenaed documents show no legitimate basis for the Attorney General's anti-parent memo. I'd like to submit this to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. All right, now to follow up on our ranking member's comment about a 22% cut to your budget, you know, I'm confident that wouldn't happen. You know, a cut to the Department of Justice would not be evenly distributed across the board. I would think that one of the last areas to trim would be the Office of Inspector General. The DOJ needs additional oversight and not less. So your office might be the only area that sees no cuts, maybe an increase. We need to figure out what's wrong, what's going wrong. Too loud? Okay. We need to figure out why in the world the Department of Justice, their reputation, well, we know why their reputation is going down, but we need to fix that. And your office, I think, is part of that process. Also, to follow up on the chairman's line of questioning in the last minute that I've got, back in 2013, I was a victim of an overzealous assistant United States attorney. You probably know of this situation, where I suffered significant abuse by the IRS. This was before I was ever a member of Congress. The abuse was so bad that I got a personal apology from the IRS Commissioner Koskinen. The misconduct was a violation of legal ethics, where the assistant United States attorney made a threat of criminal prosecution in order to obtain a civil monetary settlement. And that's a violation of legal ethics. You know, that conduct was referred to the Department of Justice Office of Professional Responsibility, where it died. So I wholeheartedly concur with the chairman that Congress needs to reevaluate this, and the Department of Justice OPR, maybe it should come under the Office of Inspector General, or maybe it just needs to be dissolved into you. But I think that needs to be looked at.
Yep.
So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Horowitz, thank you for being here. You know, it's very difficult to have a job like yours and come out smelling like a rose. Your reputation is impeccable, and I'm so glad that you're here before us today. And I'm glad that you're the Inspector General for the DOJ at these trying times, especially after coming off of COVID. Bureau of Prisons has a lot of issues that it's facing right now. You mentioned that they don't have enough staffing. And since you've been investigating the Bureau of Prisons, I understand that we've had a new director of Bureau of Prisons since 2022. Are you starting to see some good improvement on the way Bureau of Prisons has been conducting itself?
Yeah, so the new director came on board in August of 2022. We're seeing efforts to make change, which has been good, and being responsive. In fact, she's asked for, and we've been meeting quarterly, so that we can report directly to her the problems and challenges we're seeing.
You may not be able to directly answer this question because I'm asking your opinion. Is there a cultural problem at BOP that has existed for many, many years?
I think there are multiple challenges. I think one of the things that they've had a problem with is rooting out and taking action against wrongdoers and doing that in a timely fashion. And with 40,000 employees, if you don't take action, the cancer can spread. And so it's very important to take action promptly where there's wrongdoing.
If you were in charge of the Bureau of Prisons today, what's the first, second, and third actions that you would take to clean it up? Because we lost a lot of lives, and they weren't following their own guidance during
Right.
COVID.
Right.
So did they not know? Did they intentionally do it? We might never know. I look forward to that report, but you're not following your own directives. How do we get there? You're in charge today.
Yeah. So, well, I'm not sure I'd accept that job, but, and we have a report coming out actually in a few weeks about some of these big challenges. I think, first of all, you can't run an organization of that size without knowing where your staffing needs are on the healthcare side, on the correctional side. So that would be the first thing, which is get a sophisticated understanding of staffing. Second, fix the discipline system. Root out wrongdoers, reward the strong employees, and promote the strong employees. And then third, deal with your crumbling infrastructure. I mean, many of our prisons are very old. They were built decades ago. And for many of them, because inmates have aged, they're much more now more like nursing homes than they are like prisons. But they're not adapted to that.
Okay. Thank you. And finally, the oversight of the DOJ attorneys, as a new
Yes.
member of this committee, I'm stunned to know that that's the case. That can't have been an oversight.
No.
And hopefully we can correct that this time around. That's a shocking and a dangerous thing to have occurred. That's when there's no oversight and you can't do anything, and they know that. Right. The bad actors are going to act as expected.
And it's existed since the 1970s when OPR was created. The deal that was cut in 1988 when my office was created was that carve-out. And actually, the carve-out also included, by the way, FBI and DEA. And Attorney General Ashcroft changed that in 2001. Congress codified it in 2002. And as we like to say, I think everybody's better off that we've had independent oversight over FBI and DEA in the last 20 years. The arguments they made against giving us jurisdiction, we didn't have the expertise to do it. It required specialized knowledge. They knew how to do it. I think we've demonstrated over and over again through our reports that isn't the case. We can do oversight over department lawyers, and we should be doing oversight over department lawyers.
Yes, sir. Well, since you spend 25% of your time investigating the Bureau of Prisons, and I know that in the budget request, do you think your budget request is actually adequate to do all the things that you need to do? Is that substantial enough, or did you ask for what you think you could get?
Yeah, I mean, I always am realistic in this. Okay. I don't want to come in here and have the committee think I'm asking for pie in the sky. I know you have hard choices to make, difficult decisions. We've asked for staffing to address certain needs, but frankly, it's all of your decision as to how oversight of the BOP should be apportioned. We could do a lot more of this, which is why last year's enhancements were so important. We're doing on-the-ground, unannounced inspections. We showed up at Waseca on Monday morning. We showed up on the weekend to get ready. It was negative temperatures there, but we showed up. We had 7 people show up. We told the BOP at 8 a.m. on Monday that we were coming at noon on Monday because we didn't want a Potemkin village set up. We got great cooperation, by the way. I should give credit to the warden and the staff there. They welcomed us. We got a full opportunity to talk with inmates, staff, a lot of very important findings that we'll get out in the next few weeks. But that's the kind of work we could be doing more of. again, it's a question of resources and decisions on how you all want to, move whatever the number is. I know it'll be a limited resource bucket. And so, we appreciate the strong support we've gotten from the committee.
Thank you, sir. I'd love to come visit you in your office. I apologize for going over my time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate very much your time. Mr. Rogers and I'm Ranking Member Cartwright, thank you very much for this, holding this hearing, talking about the budgetary needs of DOJ. As co-chair of the Second Chance Task Force, we've now got 40 members, 20 Republican and 20 Democrats. So it's completely bipartisan. We're focused on improving the outcomes of the BOP, because the data is clear. The best way to improve that is through stable employment when they leave.
Right.
Then we follow roof over the head, car, wraparound services, mental health, addiction, etc. The OIG is currently conducting all of the BOP's efforts to construct and maintain your institutions. Last week, on Wednesday, I toured FCI Cumberland for the day with Director Peters. It was clear at the FCI that the facility did not have the physical space, just physical space, to properly implement the First Step Act, because the space was so restricted where the reentry programs can work. So President Trump passed the First Step Act. I'd like to help it be initiated and make it as real as we can. And having visited FCI Cumberland, my district, and been there before, our team has been up and about, and we're in these prisons all the time. This is my 4th meeting with Director Peters. I think she's fantastic. She's absolutely on the right track. We couldn't be more pleased, but what steps have you identified that the BOP can take to improve the facilities? Because there's a capital issue here. I'm a business guy, and I've got 260 stores around the country in 28 states. I never tell them I'm coming. Never. So that unannounced visit, that's the way to get to the truth, and not a bunch of BS and waste your time on a dog and pony show.
Right.
So I really applaud you for doing that with your team, and that's fantastic. But what are we going to do to help these facilities with the capital side? Because we're always on the operational side, to create reentry program on prisons that were built 30 years ago, just to lock people down, not about a second chance. And that's what we want to see, and that's what's going to save us money. That's going to save us billions of dollars if we get these folks out and they don't recidivate. So we got to spend some money to save way more money, 2, 3, 4x. So what's your plan on this area and reentry programming? So we can effectively implement President Trump's First Step Act?
So several important issues there to pick up on, Congressman. On infrastructure, we're actually going to be getting a report out shortly that goes in depth on the challenges the BOP has had on the infrastructure side. You're right; they have not asked for capital spending the way they need it. There are standards out there in the federal government for how much you should be asking for annually for upkeep, and the BOP has not only not done that, but really didn't have a plan on how to deal with crumbling infrastructure. When we went out to Waseca on the surprise visit, we saw it. And again, that wasn't a high-risk prison in everybody's sort of calculations. And so that was particularly concerning to us, that we were seeing those kind of issues, much like it sounds like you were seeing in Cumberland. And so, again, in that space, the BOP just, at the start, like you said, like any business, like any operation, it runs 121 facilities across the country. You need to understand how much money do you need annually to maintain upkeep, because what happens is, just to pick up what you mentioned, is when you don't maintain a facility, it crumbles more, it creates greater challenges, you can't house as many inmates sometimes as the prison was built originally to house, because you have to close parts of the prison. MCC New York is closed because it was crumbling. So the main prison in downtown Manhattan, I used to be a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. That prison, which is attached to the building I used to work in, separately attached to the courthouse, is closed. So inmates now are in various other prisons, with the Marshal Service having to spend more money to get them back and forth in and out of Manhattan, which, as you can imagine, is a challenge.
So we need you to bring to the committee your thoughts on capital.
Yes.
Separate from operational, because as we said on this committee, and we've talked about this in the past with Chairman Cartwright and others, is we see these agencies, and this is the same thing, where they just get their funding for operations, and they're too reticent to ask for the funding that they need for the capital. NIH, it's not that much different, frankly. With that big issue, I've talked to the former director there many times about that. But we need some numbers from you that says, you know, that prison is bringing out drywall people. They're bringing out carpenters. They're bringing out forklift operators. And we've got jobs for all these folks with FedEx and Amazon and all these companies, but there's a waiting list to get in to get the training, so they never get the training. And then when they go out, they don't have the skill sets. Then they recidivate, and then we pay to house them again for decades and decades. We've created a prison-to-prison cycle, and we've got to figure out how to spend a few dollars thoughtfully and carefully, because we only so much money, but this will have an ROI that's significant and change lives. So we need you to come back with us with what these facilities need to change the physical space, because right now it's off balance.
Yeah, no, and our report coming out talks about what the federal standards are, so you'll have that mark against which what the federal recommendations broadly would be for federal buildings and entities. But as we're going out and doing these, picture's worth 1,000 words, you're going to see in Waseca what the issues are. You're going to see in MCC New York the crumbling ceilings and why it had to close.
But you want to see at FCI Cumberland, they've got a beautiful area to teach people training, but the area is so small that the waiting list is hundreds of inmates who never get there, never get that second chance.
Right. And the other problem is with staffing, what we've seen now at prisons, when you don't have enough correctional staff.
Bingo.
Then you have to bring healthcare staff.
Yeah.
Then you have to bring training staff.
And we saw that every time I go to the prisons, the
All of those
augmentation
happen.
issue.
Correct.
You're staffed at 93% is the short the budget. She staffs every day at 86%,
Right.
if I got the right number right. And I don't know how you run a business if you're not staffed at 100%. I mean, in my business, if I'm not staffed at 100%, I can't take care of the customer and succeed. Yet we budget them and authorize them at 93, they staff at 86, and then they augment and they stop all the reentry.
Right. And I'll just say some prisons are going to be well below 86%. I've seen that. Others are actually going to be above 93%. And the problem is how you make sure you understand where your staffing needs are sufficient, maybe a little bit more than you need, and where they're clearly inadequate, including, by the way, on the healthcare side. The cascading challenge here, an issue, and we're about to, in the next couple months, I would anticipate we are finishing and we'll be able to issue in the next couple of months a report about Jeffrey Epstein's death in MCC New York.
Sorry I ran over, Chairman. And I want to reiterate, the Republican hit a great point. Data, data, data. Boy, do I agree with my Republican colleague. So
Time
thank
of the
you.
gentleman has expired. Mr. Gonzalez?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Inspector General, for being here. I represent 42% of the southern border, over 800 miles. And in particular, I want to thank the chairman for bringing this up because I want to tie in rural America. I feel that there's this divide that's happening in America and has nothing to do with the color of your skin or how much money you have in your bank account, who you pray to. It's where you live. And so, in particular, I want to talk about COPS grants. In your oversight of COPS grants, how successful have law enforcement in rural areas been in accessing these grants?
So, as I sit here, I don't know the exact breakdown. I can get that for you between rural and non-rural grants. We've seen challenges over the years in the COPS program. It's been one of the areas that has required more and more oversight by us, and that could benefit, frankly, from more oversight by us to make sure it's getting in the right place. And importantly, the police departments are using it in the right way. We unfortunately see instances where they're being used to, enhance benefits that they're not intended for, pay overtime that didn't happen, things like that.
Uvalde is in my district. Uvalde happened about 10 months ago, and a lot of my communities are still scared. They're still getting ready, and honestly, a lot of them submitted for COPS grants, and they were denied COPS grants near and around the Uvalde area. And so I find this a challenging point. What happened in Uvalde can happen absolutely anywhere, and we got to get ahead of these, especially in the smaller communities. So I'd love to sit down and more and specifically draw down on this. Next question on regards to COPS grants. Can you elaborate on some of the challenges that you've identified with the program's compliances? Any specifics that you can give? What actions have been proposed or implemented to assist the less populated areas?
Yeah, so several issues come up. I mean, one of the bigger challenges that we've seen occasionally are departments and local communities not being prepared for grants, not keeping the funds separate, commingling funds, not keeping sufficient records of how the money's spent so that when we go in, they can readily show us that the money was spent for approved purposes. And then we've seen on some occasions, as I just mentioned, unfortunately misuse, where it's being used to buy a fancy car, pay overtime that didn't happen, or it's padding overtime, things like that. So we've seen multiple different issues when we've come in.
Great, thank you for that. My next question is on cybersecurity. I spent 20 years in the Navy as a cryptologist, and oftentimes, especially when you're talking about budgets, cybersecurity is the last to eat, and it's often the first thing that gets attacked or dealt with. So my next question is, it was concerning when your audit report released last July found that there are no established cyber supply chain risk management programs at the DEA. How far along is the DEA and other agencies in establishing a well-equipped cyber supply chain risk management program, and what can your organization do to serve to expedite this process?
So we made multiple recommendations because, I agree with you, Congressman, we were very concerned to see that. The DEA agreed with them. We are following up on them. I can get you the most up-to-date status on them after the hearing and let you know where we currently stand. We follow up every 120 days with the component to make sure they're taking action, they're moving forward. But it is a very significant issue. Cybersecurity issues are, every day you see that headline.
Yeah, I'd be very much interested in having a follow-up conversation on that. Oftentimes, people don't understand it, and like I said, it's the last thing to get brought up or put attention towards, but this is the world we live in. Cybersecurity is at the forefront of every organization. Certainly, the DEA should be having a program in this. My next question, I understand your organization is currently conducting an audit on ATF's criminal investigation referrals and revocation of licenses for federal firearm licensees. Did the OIG take into account considerations and feedback from legal, responsible firearm advocates and community members when deciding the scope and areas of interest for your audit?
Yes, so that audit should be out in the next few weeks. We did try to go out and see what, not only how ATF was managing the program, but how it was interacting with FFLs and the entities it oversaw. So I think you'll see a fair amount of that in the report. And like I said, we're hoping it'll be out in the next few weeks.
I'm very much interested in reading that report. Having the ability of the community to engage with this, I think, is extremely important, especially, once again, responsible firearm owners are vocal, and they need to have a seat at the table.
Right.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up, Mr. Horowitz, on the discussion that Mr. Trone brought up about the Bureau of Prisons and the use of augmentation. And now you'll hear various things from various quarters about what that is, but essentially it's the question of, the ratio of correctional officers to inmates. And if we don't hit the right ratio, then we use what we call augmentation. In other words, we count non-correctional officers as correctional officers, non-correctional officer employees of the prison system as COs when arriving at the ratios, and that's what augmentation means to me. And what that means is that because of a shortage of COs, we're counting non-COs in the calculus. And so we're counting as COs people like psychologists or social workers or art teachers, people who didn't take that job because they're good at tackling inmates who are acting up or unruly or being violent. And so I have called augmentation a $50 word for cooking the books. And so here's the question. What is your assessment as to the extent to which a 22% funding cut to the Bureau of Prisons would mean? Would it exacerbate the problem of augmentation?
So the challenge for me is we haven't done an assessment of the overall budget and where the BOP is. It invariably would impact the BOP. The extent to which I'm not in a position to speak to, the director would be able to speak to that. But we have seen, just to your point, Congressman, and we'll talk about this in the Wasica report we're going to issue, and in others, we go out, the staffing shortage on the correctional side, on the correctional officer side, leads to greater use of healthcare workers, psychologists, others, to cover staff shifts, to bring in teachers, program administrators to cover correctional officers' positions, because they simply need that for the safety and security of the prison. And that means a shortage of staff to deal with health issues, a shortage of staff to bring inmates to outside medical care, because that's another issue the department has had, the BOP has had a challenge with, which is hiring sufficient numbers of healthcare, doctors, nurses, etc. And, you know, it leads to the training issue, which is you don't have the people who can run the programs that are training inmates, because in the federal prison system, almost every inmate's eventually going to get out of jail. Every inmate's eventually, almost every inmate, is going to come back to our communities. And you want them positioned to reintegrate into the community.
Thank you. I also want to pick up this discussion of oversight of the U.S. attorneys and the assistant U.S. attorneys. Right now, you can't do it. You're not authorized to do that oversight. Am I correct in that?
That's correct.
And as you mentioned, it wasn't the House's idea that you weren't able to do it. It came from that other body at the north side of the building who have odd ideas at times. And what I want to do is I want to ask you, number one, who is conducting the oversight of the U.S. attorneys and the AUSAs right now?
So that's the Office of Professional Responsibility for any professional misconduct.
And what are the arguments against your office having oversight and sunlight responsibilities? That was Brandeis's word, by the way. It wasn't transparency, it was sunlight.
Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants.
Right. What are the arguments against your office having oversight and review responsibilities of the U.S. attorneys and AUSAs?
It's essentially been the same argument that was made 20 years ago by the FBI and DEA, which is the department has expertise in ethics and misconduct, professional misconduct issues in their Office of Professional Responsibility. They've been doing this work for 40 plus years. In their view, they've been doing it successfully, and that there's no reason to change.
Does that hold any more water where it comes to U.S. attorneys and AUSAs than for other agencies that you have oversight over?
My view is that might have made sense in 1988 when we didn't exist yet and we were just being created. In 2023, we have the expertise to do it. We've got now a 35-plus year track record. We've shown that what was argued against by the FBI and DEA in 2001 and 2002 didn't have merit. We clearly should be doing that oversight. There is simply no principled reason for not having that, and why there would be two systems of oversight in the department.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back on the subcommittee, good to be with my friends, and thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for appearing. It's an honor to be on Appropriations. It's also an honor to be delegated by Appropriations to the Budget Committee, so I apologize. We got both going on at the same time. But I wanted to ask about an audit done in 2021 of the FBI's due diligence or lack thereof when requesting permission to wiretap or otherwise spy on Americans through FISA courts. The report detailed widespread noncompliance with Woods procedures, which are an internal FBI process to minimize factual inaccuracies in FISA applications by requiring the FBI to maintain supporting documentation for each factual assertion in the application. Out of over 7,000 FISA applications approved between January 2015 and March 2020, there are 183 for which the Woods file was missing, in whole or in part, correct?
Correct.
The report made 8 recommendations for the FBI and 2 for the National Security Division, correct?
Correct.
It's my understanding that recommendations 4 through 8 were resolved. Recommendations 1 through 3 made to the FBI were closed before needing to be resolved, meaning the FBI adequately revised its FISA policy preemptively before you made an official recommendation. Is that correct?
That's correct. As we were doing it and telling them what the problems were, they were trying to fix them along the
Got
way,
it.
which is exactly what we want to see happen.
Got it. Although your recommendations were resolved, are you aware of whether the FBI has located all of the missing Woods files identified in your report?
I don't believe we know the answer to that question. I can go back and double check and see where we are on that information.
I appreciate that. If the FBI cannot provide an answer to your efforts to find this information, would your office open an investigation?
Frankly, I think at this point, some of those were older. That we'd be beyond a 5-year statute of limitations. So I don't think that would be likely at this point. I think what we've been trying to do is get them to change both in fact and culturally how they look at these and how they're doing them.
I just want to make sure that the lesson learned is not just wait you out.
Oh, well, let me just say, they will not wait us out. We are still doing oversight of the FBI and how it handled, for example, the Katrina Leung situation back in 2003, 4, and 5. We continue to do follow-up with them. So 20 years later, we're still on these issues.
Good. Let me move on. At the Senate's most recent open annual worldwide threats hearing, Director Wray stated that the FBI has in the past bought precise geolocation data derived from mobile phone advertising, in the words of the Wall Street Journal, before backing away from the practice in the face of thorny legal issues. Have other parts of the DOJ purchased, or are other parts of the DOJ still purchasing this kind of information about Americans?
So we're looking at that. We saw those news stories. We're looking at that issue. I don't have anything right now that I can report to you, but I'm happy to follow up on that.
Needless to say, that would be very disturbing. How did the FBI and potentially other elements of DOJ come to believe that buying location information about Americans without a warrant would be legal, especially after the Supreme Court's decision in U.S. v. Carpenter, which held that Americans' location information is protected by the Fourth Amendment?
I think it raises precisely the issues you mentioned. I think, what I'm supposing may have happened is before Carpenter, of course, the department took advantage, at least in some instances, of the ambiguity in the law. Post-Carpenter, that, of course, shouldn't have happened.
Are you aware of any other parts of DOJ that have bought or are buying similarly sensitive information, like communications records or internet records?
I'm not at this point, although we did have recently an inquiry from Senator Wyden about a program that was being run through the state of Arizona Attorney General Office, and we're looking at those issues right now. He raised them a few weeks ago. So these are issues that are on our radar and are something we're focused on. The use of subpoena authority, the use of other authorities to obtain information.
Well, you have a track record of achieving compliance from agencies that otherwise are reluctant to provide it, and I want to thank you for that and urge you to continue your work aggressively because it doesn't seem that the message is getting through. I yield back.
We'll have a second round of questioning here. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Back to the Bureau of Prisons. I understand that in addition to conducting a limited scope review, You're conducting an audit to examine BOP's management and strategic planning. Is that correct?
Correct.
How far along are you on that study?
We're actually very far along. I think you can anticipate seeing that in the next several weeks, is my hope.
Can you give us a preview?
There are a lot of problems and challenges at the BOP with how they're strategically planning
How shocking.
issues. Yeah, and including, issues related to their audit-related work. Keep in mind, as you know, certainly, we're really the second line of defense. The first line of defense is the agency itself. They need to have a strong internal audit function to be able to deal with these issues. And that's one issue. Staffing, strategically assessing staffing, strategically looking at infrastructure challenges. The problem that we've seen at the Bureau of Prisons over and over again is the failure to appreciate how the lack of an effective approach in one area cascades through all these other areas. It happens one after the other, inevitably, that's what's occurring.
I think what we're looking for, as is the country, for that matter, is a step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that needs to be done. And we're looking to you to provide us that list of to-dos.
Yep.
And the problem, the solution, and the timeline.
Yep.
We want that.
Yep. And we
Committee. I realize that we can't interfere with your own audit, but we're doing our own audit, and we are looking to you for your expertise. Is that agreeable?
Absolutely. And we will make sure in our reports that we lay those out.
Good. One aspect of BOP's challenges, staffing shortages. Since 2015, the OIG has repeatedly identified staffing shortages as one of the most significant challenges facing BOP, and this committee has repeatedly and generously funded the Bureau of Prisons' effort in an effort to assist with staffing shortages. Yet in July 22, a hiring announcement, BOP noted staffing levels were again trending downward, ever downward. So is the BOP approaching the staffing shortage appropriately? And is there a need for more money? Is that the problem's solution?
So historically, they have not effectively approached the staffing problem. I've been encouraged in my meetings recently with the new BOP director that she appreciates that and is focused on that. She's been in the job 6-7 months now, so it's obviously a little too early to make any assessments of it, other than I can tell you I've been meeting quarterly with her, and she has taken our feedback and appears to be on top of it. I can't sit here and tell you precisely whether money is the issue or how much money would be the issue if that is the issue, because what we've seen as we've gone around is that the BOP can't even tell us when we ask how much staffing is actually needed at each prison. Where are the shortages across the country? If you look at a macro level, you will see at the higher security prisons, they are more strained in terms of the number of inmates and prison beds, not so much at the lower level security, but staffing levels are varying at those. At some prisons, they could be above the 86% number that they look to achieve, and at others, we know because we've been there, they're well below.
So it's a leadership problem?
I think historically it has been a leadership problem at not only at the headquarters level, but at the regional level and in other parts of the BOP.
Well, let the word go forth that this subcommittee will not abide lack of leadership. And if it takes staffing changes, so be it. But we're expecting results. We can't afford to have an agency this size with this important a mission as BOP. We can't afford to have them not do that job. So let's get with it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the reason we are going down the road of the report that we're about to issue on how they managed their facilities is the prison in Atlanta, which is largely closed, one of the larger BOP prisons. We went back and read their internal reports. Wasn't a surprise that they were having problems. The fish didn't rot overnight. It happened over a period of time. And yet action hadn't been taken to address them. And they had to largely close the prison. They then went through and tossed the prison. Hundreds of cell phones, lots of contraband, all sorts of, and of course now we are following up investigatively. It creates, the problems that I've been mentioning create a greater workload for the OIG, because now we're the ones dealing with contraband in the prisons, sexual assaults on the inmates. All of that cascades into more expenses, greater costs, and greater problems.
We want results,
So do we.
and we join you in that effort, and we'll stay in touch
Yes,
on this matter, if you don't mind.
absolutely.
Ms. Meng?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask about an audit that your office published in December 2022 regarding the FBI's national security undercover operations. Your findings contain several concerning items, including the failure to track any sort of data on short-term undercover activities, operational impacts from a decentralized structure, the inability to ensure experienced or qualified staff at regional locations, and the lack of mandatory continuing education or training for undercover agents. Very concerned over what this report means for oversight and accountability of the FBI's activities. I know the FBI agrees with all 10 of your recommendations. Do you have a sense of the timeline that it will take for them to implement the changes?
Certainly our hope is for some of them, they can be addressed relatively promptly in the next, in 6 months to a year, so that in 2023, several of them will get implemented. Some of them, like enhancing training, will require some effort and time to get those programs together and put them in operation. So it'll depend, but you're right, this is a very significant issue. Being an undercover agent is among the most dangerous and challenging jobs. They need to be protected. They need the right training. They need oversight, in part to make sure they don't engage in misconduct, but in part to protect themselves and their safety, and to make sure their tracks are covered, that the bad guys can't figure out who they are, can't figure out who their families are. So it's a very significant issue. We were very concerned with the findings, and I talked with FBI leadership, they were as well. And so these are very important issues, as you noted.
Do you think that the FBI's fiscal year 24 budget request will enable it to continue to try to implement your recommendations? And if Congress provides 22 funding levels for the FBI, what impact would that have on implementation?
So it would be a challenge for me to speak to the FBI's sort of budget situation, particularly given the size of its budget and whether it could move funding around. I would say that many of these recommendations in this space don't necessarily require a lot of additional resources. They require focus and attention and effort, some resources, but not a substantial amount of resources.
And my last question is, I wanted to ask you about the issue of child exploitation. The president requested $130 million for the missing and exploited children's budget for fiscal year 24, which includes some amount of funding for the ICAC task force, Internet Crimes Against Children. According to the GAO, there was a 35% increase in reports of suspected child sexual exploitation from 2020 to 2021. Given this horrific rise in child exploitation crimes, I'm very troubled over the reports that ICAC has not received the full funding amount they're authorized at. These task forces provide critical resources to help protect our children and prevent exploitation among our most vulnerable. Can you explain why, given the increased need, DOJ is not requesting the full authorized amount specifically for ICACs?
As to their decisions on what to request or not, I'd really turn you to them. We don't get involved in their internal discussions on where to fund, but I agree with you completely about the importance of ICAC, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. In fact, when we did our review of the FBI's handling of the Nassar matter, we identified a number of issues there in terms of how the FBI was dealing with those challenges, both from a headquarters level and a field office level. And we're in the middle now of a follow-on review of this issue of how it's dealing with hands-on child exploitation.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about some revelations over the past couple of days about some information that's come from the Justice Department about the targeting of American parents voicing concerns about controversial curricula and education-related policies at local school board meetings. I know Mr. Clyde has asked a little bit about that, but on the Judiciary Committee received some documents a day before we had a hearing on the lack of compliance with those requests. But after reviewing the material, it's clear that the Biden administration misused federal law enforcement resources for purely political purposes. The Justice Department's own documents make clear that there was never a legitimate basis for AG Garland's directive that inserted federal law enforcement into local school board matters. The administration extensively colluded with education special interests to create the predicate for the directive. And if the DOJ had performed due diligence before pushing this directive, it would have concluded that there was no legitimate basis for the anti-parent directive and that it was an extreme misuse of federal authority. Local law enforcement agencies described his directive as a manufactured problem and rightly believed that any criminal threats and violence were matters best handled by local authorities. And in a letter to the committee, the FBI acknowledged that it opened 25 investigations with a special threat tag meant to track school board threats. 6 of those investigations were handled by the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, showing that the federal counterterrorism resources were used against parents. It appears that the administration's goal was to silence the critics of its radical education policies and neutralize an issue that was threatening prospects in the close gubernatorial race in my home state of Virginia. The interim report unequivocally demonstrates that law enforcement powers were weaponized against American parents exercising their First Amendment rights at the direction of the Biden administration. Every parent has the right to exercise their fundamental constitutional right to speak and advocate for their children without being labeled by the FBI with a threat tag. This is a chilling example of our federal government being weaponized against those it's meant to serve. And we're going to continue in the Judiciary Committee to ensure that the DOJ and the FBI produce the necessary material to uncover the facts that will inform potential legislative reforms. My question to you, are you prepared to open an investigation into the misuse of those resources?
I think I saw the report that was issued earlier in the week or last week by the committee. I'm going to take a look at it, and I'm certainly happy to talk further with you and the chairman of the committee about it. At this point, I'm not in a position really to speak to what actions we may or may not take. And, one of the things we carefully look at before we do any work is to understand what the predication is, to make sure we're opening in an area that's appropriate to open in.
And once again, I'll say, don't let the lessons learned be that they can misuse resources, investigate American parents, and get away with it. So I'd encourage you to open that investigation and take a closer look. Thank you. I yield back.
Yeah, I'd like to move back to something that actually could move us forward together. We need you to help us get data when we move forward here in this next report on the vacancies in healthcare and behavioral health, social workers, addiction workers. All those counselor positions are ones that are understaffed. They're not filled consistently throughout the BOP. And so we've got to report on this data. If we don't have the data, we have no chance of winning. And I know my Republican colleagues have asked that, and I agree with them completely. We got to have the data. The second point I want to build on is Chairman Rogers I hit the nail on the head. We've got to have great leadership. And I dealt with the previous director of the BOP for over 2 years. And it came so bad, Mr. Chairman, that I suggested at the hearing, this hearing, that he be fired, and told him that. I said, I've recommended you be fired, sir, because he was so incompetent. So Director Peters has inherited a $9 billion business that is broken, dysfunctional, no data coming out of it, no focus on second chances for folks, so we could spend the $9 billion and take that one day to $7 or $6 billion when people get a second chance and they're successful. So I'm with Chairman Rogers. We need you to hold her feet to the fire. She's only been there 7 months. As I said, I met with her 4 times, and I think she's right on target. She's right on target. But we got to keep giving her the resources and help her be successful. Because that's our job, help her be successful. Because the previous guy had no interest in being successful. He just wanted to hold down a job. Now, Narcan. This is very important to Chairman Rogers, I know, and to me. And, we're going to put report language in, suggest that it get added that when inmates leave, they're 12.7 times more likely to die of an overdose death right after they leave prison. We believe they need to leave prison, ones that have had a drug issue, with 2 doses of Narcan. Mm-hmm. So there's a chance we keep these people alive if they make a mistake and they walk back in to the drug area addiction. So that we think would make a lot of sense. Does that language make sense to you?
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. I'll add, we've seen the challenge of the BOP with inmates who come into the prison with an addiction and not being able to address that promptly, leading to various issues. One of our reports is going to mention and reference that. So it's not only going out, it's coming in.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And then training, we're going to put recommended language also on training BOP operators to the use of Narcan. And so they've got to understand that, and we need data. That's the biggest problem with the BOP is data, data, data. There ain't no damn data. So we need to know how many of them got trained, and then how many times they used the Narcan, then how many folks overdosed. But all that information was never there under the previous administration. Director Peter wants to get it, and we need to give her direction to come back with that information so we can save lives.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges she has coming in as a new leader, including, this is a nationwide business, as you mentioned, of 121 institutions. I'm now not even talking about the $500 million or so this committee apportions to halfway houses. Yep. Right? We haven't even talked about the halfway houses. Just the prisons, you need strong regional directors, you need strong wardens. Leadership is at all levels, as most of us who've been involved in these issues know. Middle management is actually among the most important in an organization. And so you need the strong leadership at the top. I've certainly had very good discussions with her and great engagement with her, but she's going to need strong middle managers across the organization.
She has a ton of dead wood down in the middle area that no one ever paid any attention to. So you've got to encourage her to get metrics on turnover metrics, some that are involuntary turnover, but also voluntary but involuntary, because she needs more involuntary turnover where we terminate someone because they're not doing the damn job.
Well, we've seen, just in our report we issued earlier this week, our capstone report on how the BOP responded to the COVID crisis, we saw several prisons where wardens were very effective and proactive, and then we saw other prisons where that didn't happen. And so she does have a set of at least anecdotal data to see where the strengths and weaknesses were. COVID really played it out. I mean, it was an unexpected challenge for managers to have to deal with, the wardens. It exposed the weaknesses in staffing because institutions that were below on healthcare staffing were hit very hard, as you might guess, by COVID. So she does have now at least 2 or 3 years of experiences with an unexpected 100-year crisis to see how management responded to that and which managers did it effectively and which managers maybe didn't.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Cartwright, do you have any further questions?
I don't if you don't.
I do not. Any other member wish to be heard? Well, Mr. OIG, that concludes today's hearing. I think it's been very productive. You made an excellent presentation. We like what we hear. Without objection, all members will have 7 days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.